Hello, everyone. Hello, I'm Michael Berkman, Director of the Brookings Institution for Democracy, and it is good to be back in the Katz building. This is one of our favorite venues, and it's our first event here in over 2 years. Thank you to Penn State Law and the School of International Affairs for co-sponsoring today's event. It's good to see you all today, and welcome to our virtual participants as well. On one of our recent shows on our podcast, Democracy Works, we talked with a scholar of political violence about what happens when the loser denies the legitimacy of a free and fair election. Central to democracy is the idea that power is transferred peacefully, that the losers accept their loss and agree to be governed by the winner, and then they go on to fight another day. But this idea is precarious. It rests on nothing but a common agreement. Refusing to concede, denying the legitimacy of a fair election, imperils democracy and can lead to violence. Our guest today understands this clearly. Robert Kagan has argued that there was nothing inevitable about the relatively peaceful liberal democratic order, and that there was nothing inevitable about the perseverance of American democracy. In fact, Dr. Kagan argues that because so many reject the 2020 presidential election, we are already in a constitutional crisis, and it will take deliberate actions by the public and members of both political parties to get us out. For too many politicians, a recognition of our condition, let alone a commitment to those actions, appears to be a long way off. Robert Kagan is the Stephen and Barbara Friedman Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a member of the Foreign Affairs Policy Board in the U.S. State Department. He is the author of The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World, and the New York Times bestseller, The World America Made. Kagan is also a contributing columnist at The Washington Post, where he published an essay last fall called Our Constitutional Crisis is Already Here. In it, he clearly and concisely lays out a path to electoral disaster that could unfold between now and January 2025. We share his concerns, and that is why we invited him here today to talk with us. Of course, it's fortuitous that Dr. Kagan joins us as we witness a vicious authoritarian attack on a neighboring nation and its democratically elected government. I'm sure he'll speak to the events in Ukraine as well. In addition, please join us at the end of the month for a visit from Peter Pomerantsev of Johns Hopkins University, who will give two talks, one on Ukraine and one on disinformation here and abroad. And tonight at 7, in room 12 of this building, there will be a panel discussion with 4 faculty from the College of the Liberal Arts on these events as well. More details on that can be found on our webpage, including how to participate virtually. With that, please join me in welcoming Robert Kagan to Penn State.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a real pleasure to be here, and there's so much going on in the world. I will be happy to talk about either of these things. I'm actually a foreign policy guy by training. This other excursion was more of a different path for me. So I'm always happy to talk about foreign policy. And we can get around to talking about Ukraine, and I will. I will just say, though, that what happens in the next 24 to 48 hours is going to have a huge impact on the future history of the world. Exactly what Putin does and does not do and how the Ukrainians respond over the next couple of days is going to be a critical moment. As I say, we could talk about that some more. There are many lessons coming out of the Ukraine episode, but one very general lesson, which I think applies very much to the original topic of this lecture, is that I think it's time we started taking what people say they're going to do seriously, that we begin to take capacity seriously when we plan ahead, that it matters what people think they have the capacity to do as well. We spend a lot of time, we spent weeks and weeks and weeks inside, trying to crawl inside Vladimir Putin's head. And I would say most experts believed that he would not invade. And I think a lot of that was just, we really weren't climbing inside his head, we were climbing inside our own heads. And we did not take seriously the possibility that it was very hard for us to believe that he would take the measures that he's taken. And I think that's obviously because we've been living in a world for decades where this kind of thing didn't happen. We can talk about why it's happened now and why it didn't happen before, but certainly we're not used to it, and our expectations are that things will basically turn out. We have a lot of theories which we developed in the aftermath of the Cold War about the way the world works. And I think one of the reasons that this invasion has so shocked and horrified Americans is that this is not the way we thought the world works anymore. But it does, and that is relevant to our domestic situation as well. We need to stop believing or deluding ourselves that bad things can't happen, that people won't do bad things. because they will and they do. And so we need to be prepared for that. And I wrote this article in the fall, as Michael said, and I must say it all seemed very obvious to me, but a lot of people were very troubled by it and upset by it and worried by it. I wish I could say it was overstated, looking back on it. But as I look at what's happened since that article, and since people got very worried about where our electoral system is headed, on the one hand, no steps have been taken to prevent the potential disasters that lie ahead of us. Congress has been unable to pass legislation repairing some of the deficiencies in the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court has created, has not been able to take a vote on the Electoral Count Act, which is that, the bargain of the 1876 election, which haunts us to this day when it comes to deciding what an election, what are the results of an election. All those state legislatures that have been passing laws, state laws which allow state legislatures to pursue criminal action against poll watchers for standing in the wrong place or for any other number of things, all of which are designed to intimidate poll workers. State legislatures that have passed legislation which effectively allows a state's legislature to decide who won the election in the state, rather than whatever vote count is taken by those authorities that are responsible for that. We've already now learned what a serious effort was made after the 2020 election to try to overturn it, either through sending different slates of electors to the Electoral College or having the vice president effectively overturn the election. We now know in detail that these actions were not only contemplated, but were heading down the road toward completion. The 2020 quote-unquote stop the steal effort of the Trump movement was very amateurish, and they ultimately lost because a few people in critical states, people we'd never heard of before, actually insisted on having some integrity and not disavowing their own electoral count. But the Republican Party has taken steps since that time to eliminate those people and have them replaced. Trump is running candidates against the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia, who refused to find the votes that he wanted. Trump is running Republican opponents to every single one of the Republicans who voted for impeachment. The party is cleansing itself of dissenters, as we see in the case of Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. We are going ahead in full force. And one of the other things that has happened since then, because one of my concerns when I wrote the article was the possibility of violence on election day or in the period following election day in the next elections. But the proclivity to violence has, if anything, only increased since then. And in the middle of this Ukraine crisis, when people are actually fighting for their homes and their freedom, we're going to have a truckers' convoy fighting for the freedom not to be vaccinated and not to be compelled to wear masks, but also just not to be vaccinated. And so, as much as I would like to believe, and as a foreign policy guy, I'm now completely fixated on what's happening in Europe, and I think it's right to be. I think, as I said, history will be shaped by what happens in Ukraine going forward. But unfortunately, it is now again distracting our attention from the very great crisis that we are already in. And that crisis now ought to be very clear in two senses. One is, if there is a challenge, if there is an electoral challenge which could lead at the very least to chaos, with contested delegations in states, with protests on both sides, with potentially violence on both sides? Is it really hard to imagine weeks and weeks of violence or potential violence in states where the electoral count has been contested? I don't find it hard to believe. We're a very well-armed country. And we are increasingly, some of us are increasingly bringing our heavy weapons to protests. And so I think that's a real possibility. Nothing has changed in terms of Trump's complete dominance of the Republican Party, which I find interesting because I think it's pretty clear that Trump is not fully in control of the movement that supports him. He can get crosswise with them, as he did on the vaccination question, where he wanted to be boasting of Operation Warp Speed and his role in getting the vaccine created, which is ironically a normal politician's kind of boast. But his movement immediately told him that that was unacceptable and he had to backtrack and get back in the right position on vaccinations. And then it's been interesting to watch him on Russia, obviously, because, basically a day before, or in fact the day of the invasion, he was talking about how savvy and what a genius Putin is. And he has had to backtrack on that because even in Republican circles, public opinion has shifted so dramatically that Republicans who were basically 50-50 or agnostic on the subject of Ukraine before are now pretty much where the rest of the country is in terms of that, which is basically sort of 75-25, being sympathetic to Ukraine and to doing more for Ukraine. So on the one hand, Trump is not completely in control, but on the other hand, politically, he still is completely in control. He's far ahead of any other candidate in the polls, and I think we have to assume that he will be the nominee. And by the way, he can win a fair election. I don't rule it out. But even his winning a fair election is a disaster for us because he has demonstrated that he has, not only does he have no regard for democratic principles and customs and behaviors, but he is perfectly willing to run roughshod over them in his own interest. And next time he will not have William Barr. By the way, I never thought I'd say he would not have William Barr getting in his way, because William Barr did not get in his way very much. He's much more courageous in after-the-fact books than he was at the time. But in any case, even William Barr won't be there. Well, we will have nothing but yes people throughout the administration who have entered the administration knowing what this guy is, which some people at least could claim in 2016 that they didn't. But they will know what he is, they will know what he's done, they will know that he tried to overthrow the government and overturn an election, and they're still going to be working for him, which means they're going to help him do what he wants to do. So we have a crisis that will occur whether he is put into power illegitimately or legitimately, because we know what he is, and we can't unknow it. And that gets me back to if we've learned one thing from Ukraine, it is that we better take seriously what people say they're going to do and have the capacity to do. So, that is the situation that we're still in. Obviously, we have missed opportunities over the last few months to repair some of the institutions and rules that are necessary to provide any semblance of a safeguard against this happening. I won't go through why that's happened. You all know perfectly well as I do, why Congress has not taken any action. And so we are much closer to the next election without having in any way addressed this problem. So the only glimmer of hope that I actually have these days actually comes from this international crisis. And let me tell you what I mean. It wouldn't be the first time that an international crisis shook up the domestic political system in such a way as to strengthen those who actually do believe in the idea of democracy. I think this conflict is being portrayed not only by us, but by Europeans and certainly by the Ukrainians themselves as not just an attack on Ukraine, but an attack on democracy. And it's true, by the way. What is the difference between a Ukrainian and a Russian today? Many Ukrainians are Russian speakers. They certainly are, in Putin's own terms, Slavic brothers and sisters. What is the difference? The difference is one lives under a imperfect but nevertheless very clearly a democratic government and wishes to be part of the West, and the other one is ruled by someone who is hostile to democracy and hostile to the West. That is the difference. It is a difference of belief as much as anything. It is not geostrategic to some extent, although Putin, I think, sees enormous strategic benefits if he is able to acquire Ukraine, but I think it transcends even strategic considerations. Therefore, and it's been interesting, as I mentioned, to see how Republican opinion has shifted in a way that, at least for the moment, Trump and Tucker Carlson and Pompeo look like fools and are being ridiculed to some extent. Now, most Republicans don't even want to utter the word Trump. It's like Voldemort. You can't even say his name, because then you'd have to answer a question about him, which I don't think was the reason you couldn't say Voldemort's name. But in any case, that is, Republicans are now gung-ho on Ukraine. They're gung-ho on being anti-Putin. But if you ask them, what about the fact that Trump was just praising Putin 3 days ago, they stare at you blankly and answer a different question. So all that being said, I started off this part of the talk by saying I have some hope. The hope is that at least some Republicans, and maybe for shorthand I'll say suburban Republicans, may decide that in this world that we now live in since the invasion of Ukraine, we can't afford to have someone like Trump with his finger on the button, being in charge of this vast alliance that this administration has so successfully corralled and pulled together. Not that it was hard, they were there, but do we want to have a president who is A, unpredictable, B, ignorant, and C, his hallmark is destroying the alliance? So this may be I'm very rarely optimistic, and I'm very rarely enthusiastic about any possibility, so I'm clinging to this one. But I do think we certainly have seen, for the first time, as close to a Republican repudiation of Trump as we're likely to get without anybody actually saying it. What this translates into, I don't know. And of course, 2024 is a million years from now in political terms. And we have a 2022 election in the meantime, which will not, I think, necessarily be heavily affected by this international crisis. So that's my glimmer of hope. At the larger level, I suppose we should all ask ourselves, although we have practical work that needs to be done now, but we also should spend our time, and especially you as students or practitioners of the law, and particularly constitutional law, we do need to think a little bit about how we got here, how we got to this point, because I myself am trying to think about how much of it was an existing condition of America, how much of these things that we've seen rise up to the point of threatening our democracy, how much of those were just baked into the system and have been there just waiting for the spark, and how much of it was the unique qualities of Trump. And I think, as always in history, you're not going to get a definitive answer. There were, for instance, if you look at historical examples, there were alternatives to Adolf Hitler in Germany. There were people like Gustav Stresemann, who was the foreign minister for many years of the Weimar Republic. His goals were not unlike Hitler's, and most Germans' goals were very similar to Hitler's, but Hitler turned out to be special. Stresemann attempted to achieve those goals within the existing liberal system. Hitler's goal was to overthrow that liberal system, so it mattered that it was Hitler. You could say the same thing about Mussolini. Yes, there was the bitterness after World War I that Mussolini was able to take advantage of. There was the fear of communism among Italian middle and upper classes that he was able to pick on. But Mussolini himself was also special. So it's a complicated equation to try to get right. How much of it was Trump and how much of it was us? And my view is that Trump was and is a decisive factor because of the nature of his personality. In a way, because I believe his personality defect, which is his unbelievable and probably clinical narcissism, actually has made him an effective, charismatic leader of angry people. In a way that other pretenders to that position failed. You know, we could have had Ted Cruz at the head of this movement, and we know as much as we know everything we need to know about Ted Cruz, but he's not Donald Trump. And by the way, because he's not Donald Trump, he never developed the following that Donald Trump has. In fact, Donald Trump destroyed him as he destroyed everybody else in the primaries. But I can imagine any number of other leaders. My hope would be that the movement, the Republican base that is now almost entirely devoted to Trump, would split among different pretenders. Some go to Josh Hawley, some go to Tom Cotton, some go to Tucker Carlson, some go to DeSantis, right? But that has not yet happened. Trump, as I say, is still the dominant force in the party. And again, I just think that while the kindling was there, the underlying attitudes were there, the tribalism was there, the racism was there, the resentments were there, but it really did take someone like Trump to turn that into something that could be a real threat to our democracy. Now, that's purely theoretical, and it doesn't matter at all, because Trump is going to be the Republican nominee unless something very strange happens, which means we are going to be up against this threat in the years ahead. What can we do about it? Well, as I say, we've already not done the things that we all agreed who were worried about this all agreed needed to be done. Those things have not been done. How do we win now? How do we prevent him from getting into office now? I really do think that is unfortunately going to require that all of us as individuals be deeply engaged in the political struggles in our communities, in our states, and in our nation in a way that we are not used to doing anymore. There's no question that the organized Trump movement has been operating at a local level with much greater organization and intensity than those who would oppose them. And I don't think we can expect that if no one opposes them with equal intensity, that they're not going to be successful. And there are so many issues on which so many Americans are willing to countenance the undemocratic behavior of Trump and others in the Republican Party because they agree with them on mask mandates, or because they agree with them on, if they even understood what critical race theory meant, they think they agree about it, right? And to me, this is the saddest part of this whole story about America. I mean, the thing, it never surprised me that people had grievances, but my feeling was always, whatever the question is, the answer is not Donald Trump. And yet, people do believe the answer is Donald Trump, and that just, to me, says that a very, very large, substantial number of Americans do not really value universal rights. And I must say that is kind of where I am right now, that the founders created a system which was unlike any other system in history, and it's really worth remembering what a true, and to use the phrase of, what's his name? Never mind. Anyway, it was a true radical revolution. Gordon Wood, thank you. that it really was a radical revolution, and it was a radical revolution in the way that it dealt with the question of rights. Because, the observation that Frank Fukuyama, borrowing from Hegel, borrowing from Kojève, etc., made, that what people want is recognition of their dignity, of their individuality. People want that. And that is somehow the root of democracy. I don't think that's right. People do want that for themselves. They want to be recognized. They want their identity to take it seriously. They want to be treated as individuals deserving of respect. But do they care whether anybody else who is not like them is also treated that way? And that's the true meaning of liberalism, that you're expanding individual rights for everybody. It's easy for you to say, I've got mine, and that's what I want. The hard part is saying, not only do they have to get theirs, but part of them getting theirs is going to come out of mine. And, but that is the republic that the founders created, and that is what they relied on. And the question that I sometimes have is, did they create a system that was too good for Americans, or maybe too good for humans? In the sense that humans' tribalism is so deeply, almost genetically wired that it's very difficult to overcome. And that no other experiment in history has really attempted to overcome it. If you compare Americans' the American universal attitude toward rights compared to English rights, English also believed in rights, but they believed it for English people. I mean, one of the reasons that we had to have a revolution, and the one reason we had a Declaration of Independence, and one reason that we turned to universal rights, I don't know why I'm saying we, these were other people doing this hundreds of years ago, but the founders, was because they needed to say that they had these individual rights regardless of their English heritage, that the rights were inherent in their humanity, not in their Englishness. And that is what this country has been based on, but it's unclear how many Americans actually ever really bought into it. Certainly for white Americans, as long as they were on top, they were okay with it. But the minute that the expansion of rights began to cut into their privileged position, that was when they were no longer interested in universal rights. That's a very broad statement. It's not true of all, obviously, but that is, to some extent, the explanation for this trend that we've seen in recent years. And I could go on, but I won't here because I want to leave enough time for our discussion. But there are real questions about how deeply committed Americans are to these principles. Again, my hope would be that, as has happened in the past, maybe an international conflict, which is being portrayed, I think, legitimately as, among other things, a struggle between democracy and autocracy, may remind Americans that, yeah, we're supposed to be for the democracy part of that. It has had that, these kinds of crises have had that effect on the United States in the past. If you look at America circa 1936, 1937, America was in pretty bad shape then, not just because of the Depression, but because of political divisions, because of rampant racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigration sentiment, economic isolationism, as well as political isolationism, and really, a very large segment of the population not feeling that Hitler was such a problem, but really feeling that maybe Hitler was the answer to communism, which is what they were really afraid of. So we've been in places like this before, and World War II basically flattened the alternate argument for quite some time. And I would say, if the literature, historical literature suggests that at least some element of the civil rights movement got a boost from the Cold War competition, insofar as Americans felt like, well, maybe we actually do have to start practicing more democracy at home if we're going to claim to be the leader of the free world, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to overdo how much that played a role, but it did play some role. And so, as I say, maybe getting back to my more optimistic and enthusiastic self, maybe the fact that we are now in a crisis that is understood to be a crisis of democracy in general, and because there's been this enormous international outpouring on behalf not just of the Ukrainian people, but I think on behalf of the principles of liberalism, that maybe this will have some blowback, positive blowback effect in the United States. But what I can say is that that will be fortuitous if true, but it will not be on the basis of anything that we have done. And I wish that we would now start taking some responsibility for saving our own democracy, which I do believe is still very much at risk. So on that, let me end with that, and maybe we can turn to Q's and A's. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Bob, for your lecture. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. My name is Jenna Spinelli. I am the communications specialist for the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. We would love to take your questions, both folks here with us in person and those watching online right now. So I will be keeping an eye on the questions coming in online. Anyone who has a question here in the room, you can come up to the microphones at either end, and we will try to go back and forth. And thank you again to Penn State Law and the School of International Affairs for co-sponsoring this event and working with us on all of the logistical details. Associate Dean Margaret Hu and Mike and the rest of the technical team here. And thank you also to our partners at CNET for live streaming today's lecture. So Paul, I want to start with something you mentioned, which is several times, which was this notion that perhaps we need to practice democracy more as a way to keep in check some of our more tribal instincts and those types of things. That's certainly a common theme throughout democracy scholarship over time. But as you know, there's also some concern or the belief that too much democracy is not necessarily a good thing either. So how do you think about that balance in your mind, or how did you think about it as you were working on your Washington Post piece?
Well, it's an excellent point because, I think where we definitely have had too much democracy is in party primary systems. And what's sort of interesting is that, as I'm sure some of you know, after the McGovern loss in 1972, the Democratic Party, whose primary system had gotten increasingly democratic, decided they needed to get a little bit more control of the primary selection process and instituted some reforms, which some of which we could even see today. I don't know whether superdelegates was created then, but the principle of superdelegates is certainly in that thing. Now, and then on the other side, the Republicans had actually almost completely democratized their primary system, which, you think, well, that's more democratic, but no one ever said that the selection of party candidates had to be democratic. And I would say there is an argument for saying, give me some smoke-filled rooms. Because one thing we know is that organized political parties that were less democratic, i.e. like the Democratic Party throughout much the first half of the 20th century, or the Republican Party for that matter, they weeded out the Donald Trumps of this world. No one was nominating Father Coughlin in the 1930s, and the closest you ever got was like Robert Taft, who was a thoroughly conventional politician. And it's only you can only get a Donald Trump if you have a completely democratic system, which, by the way, it's democratic in a way, but of course we're talking about a fraction of the country and a fraction of that fraction. And when you're talking about primary voters, then you're talking about a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. So it's a very small number of people that are making the decision, but it's being made democratically. So I would have hoped the Republican Party would want to get control of itself, but it has not, for obvious reasons. Now, that's true in the party system. In the system at large, I'm not. I think more democracy is better, and we have certain obstacles to democracy that we've created, including, for instance, the filibuster, which, there are arguments for the filibuster, but this is clearly one of those times when it's something that does need to be overridden, and it would be more democratic to override it, and yet we obviously, for all kinds of reasons that can't bring ourselves to do it. So the only place where I would like to see less democracy is in primaries.
We have a question here from the YouTube chats. If you could please discuss the constitutional and other implications of a Justice Department decision to or not to prosecute Donald Trump for January 6th.
Okay, well now let me say what I should have said at the very beginning. I am not a constitutional scholar or lawyer or anything like that, so probably should open this question to the audience. So I mean, insofar as if that's a legal question, I don't know what the right answer should have been or would be. I personally would like to see Donald Trump convicted of everything that he ought to be convicted of, but I don't know whether the Justice Department is right or wrong.
Sure. So I heard you mention earlier today that you are currently, or have perhaps just finished, a book about the 1930s. You alluded to that briefly in your remarks. Can you tell us more about the thesis in that book, when we can expect it, all of those kinds of things?
Yeah, it's actually a book. It's the second volume of a multi-volume history of American foreign policy. The first volume came out about 13 years ago or so, 14 years ago. And that covered up to 1900, and this book covers from 1900 to 1941. And it's really, most of all, about Americans becoming powerful enough that their role in the international system had objectively changed, but their own psychological reaction to that was extremely complicated. And Americans didn't really want to be involved in the world. They thought they had a good deal not being involved, but then, just the way we are now, they think they don't want to be involved, and then something happens and they become outraged. So like the sinking of the Lusitania, and then further sinking of American ships, which we could have just stopped sending our ships. You know what I mean? There were other answers to that, but that wasn't the choice we made. Anyway, adjusting to this new role, and particularly going through the 1930s, when we were really desperately trying to stay out of world affairs, and just for a variety of reasons, including our own hegemonic tendencies, which is the paradox, we wound up getting sucked back into conflict anyway in World War II.
Okay. And just a reminder, if anyone has a question, you can come on down and ask it. But while folks are making their way, I will ask one more. As we all know, President Biden is giving his State of the Union address tonight. What message do you think that he should be sending to the American people with regard to Ukraine tonight?
That is also, for me at least, a very interesting question, because I have my view as a citizen, and then I have my view as a historian. My view as a citizen is, you got to tell Americans what's at stake here, and you need to rally the country. But I studied Franklin Roosevelt very carefully and how he managed public opinion, and I think I'm now in agreement that you have to allow public opinion time to move, and it's a mistake to push too far too fast. And so, where the Biden administration is right now, as of today, is where I think the dead center of the American public's view is, which is we should do everything we can to help the Ukrainians short of war, which, by the way, was also very much the American position in the after 1938 and right up until Pearl Harbor, really, that we should do everything we can to help these guys except go to war. And now, as it happened, everything that we did to help them got us into the war, right? But we were willing to get in that way. So all I'm saying is, if people are expecting Biden to give the Dean Acheson, president of the creation, this is a new world order, and blah, 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 I don't think he's going to do that, and I'm sympathetic to him for not doing that. The American people. So And as I mentioned earlier, things are going to happen over the next couple of days, which are also going to have a huge effect on American public opinion. And if, in fact, Putin decides the only way he can win in Ukraine is by killing tens of thousands of people, Americans are going to respond to that too. So in a way, it doesn't matter what Biden says right now, if that makes any sense. I don't mean, obviously it matters what the president says in the State of the Union, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. Let's go here to Amy.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I was a little troubled by the kind of American exceptionalism and the idea that what we've been bequeathed may have been too good for us, particularly because what we were bequeathed was a particular set of institutions that were crafted from racial dominance, class dominance, and with some intent to preserve those things. And those same institutions are the ones that have enabled minority rule now. So I'm just curious how you connect that to the idea that we were giving something that was too good for us.
Fair enough, and in a way, your point is also proof of that in a certain sense. But I mean, insofar as the Declaration of Independence spoke of universal principles, and insofar as the sort of founding spirit of our government was about universal individual rights, all I'm saying is it was clear from the beginning that we weren't actually committed to universal individual rights. So, when you talk about slavery and the American system, slavery, in my view, if the country had just been founded on the basis of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and then the question of slavery had come up as a new phenomenon, I would like to think that they would have rejected it as being too grossly at odds with the founding principles. But because the slavery was a holdover from a previous regime that was not based on universal principles, but it had become, as you say, part of the woof and warp of American society, economically, politically, and every other way. And so, yes, they built their these new institutions around slavery to defend it, even as the principles of the Declaration undermined it. And by the way, the founders, as you know, were acutely aware of the contradiction. And I think some of them wishfully hoped that the contradiction would ultimately resolve in the eradication of slavery, even though they themselves were not willing to eradicate slavery, right? But it wasn't as if they didn't know they had a problem. And ultimately, the country went to war over the problem, right? So, and you'd have to say that it was because of the universal principles. I mean, Lincoln directly says, as most of the anti-slavery movement did at that time, that the Constitution was what John Quincy Adams called a bargain with the devil, and that the real America was the Declaration. So at least Lincoln could appeal to something that the founders had created and claim that that is the real soul of our country. And, he has this wonderful quasi-biblical reference about the picture of silver and the apple of gold, with the apple of gold being the Declaration and the picture of silver, the frame being the Constitution. And he says the frame was built for the apple wasn't built for the frame. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying. So,
I do. I just think that as long as we fetishize that moment, and as long as we fetishize those institutions.
Fetishize what moment?
Well, I mean, I think that probably, I'll just accept your answer and let other people ask questions, but.
I mean, it's an interesting discussion. I don't mind having it.
Well, but there are other people.
Okay.
Yeah, stick around, Amy. We can pick it up later on. Let's come over here.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for speaking. I thought it was really interesting. But when me and my friends discuss this constitutional and democratic crisis that we're in, a lot of us seem to think that it kind of stems from the fact that we have a two-party duopoly in the U.S. And I just kind of want to hear your takes on what you think about, is that two-party system a major contributing factor to this that we're in, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do, and I say this as again, reminding you that I'm not a constitutional scholar, but my take on it, for whatever it's worth, is that the founders did not anticipate parties playing the role that they wound up playing. Now, which is ironic since the founders themselves began political parties, etc., but that was not what they thought. So they create the constitutional checks and balances that they created were not, it did not occur to them that they would effectively be overridden by party loyalty. I think the founders believed that Congress would be jealous of its prerogatives, the states would be jealous of their prerogatives, the executive would be jealous of its prerogatives, and the court would, adjudicate these things. Maybe, I don't even know if the founders thought that or whether that was just Marshall. But in any case, that was the division. So it didn't occur, I think it literally did not occur to them that if the president was of one party, that the members of Congress would give their loyalty to the executive rather than uphold congressional prerogatives. And through most of American history, that was true. It's interesting as you go back, before the Cold War, I'd say, but maybe even during the Cold War, even congressional leaders of the same party wouldn't give powers to the executive because they were standing up for Congress. But now, when we look at the imperial presidency and the continually expanding powers of the executive, I mean, it's largely because when the president's party is in power, they are happy to grant him or her those privileges because it's of the same party. And then when the next party comes in, they're willing to grant privileges. So parties have definitely messed up, I think, what the original plan was. Now, the original plan was based on an assumption about how the states were going to operate. The states at that time were basically separate countries. They never thought they would band together. They certainly didn't think you could have a demagogue that would find support in every single state, et cetera, et cetera. So what you say is certainly true. Now, what can we do about it at this point? I honestly, we're not going to get rid of the two-party system. So somehow we have to instill in people a sense that it isn't just about party victory at every stage. That's going to be tough because, of course, it's always been about party victory.
Thank you.
I want to jump in and take a question from online. Switching back to Ukraine and foreign policy, how much does the fight for democracy get set back if Ukraine loses against Russia?
I mean, it's terrible to say this, but I feel like the Ukrainians are going to fight and die so that we may be educated. And one of the things that I have been surprised by, and I would say pleasantly surprised by, is the degree of unity and cohesiveness and participation of all the world's democracies. I mean, if you believe in something called the liberal world order, which all these countries in Europe and the United States and Asia belong to, it hasn't been divided and at odds and uncertain. It's been very, collectively strong. And so in a way, that's encouraging. And if the consequence of this is that we have awakened to this threat, and by the way, there are threat. This isn't the only threat. I mean, we need to think about what China is going to do now, because it's a moment of vulnerability for us. Although I think the way the liberal world has responded may be a deterrent to Xi taking action at this particular moment. But I've been sort of heartened at that, and I wish that it had happened soon enough that we could have prevented this Ukraine disaster from happening. But if history tells us anything, it's that we're never quite on top of these early crises, and the only hope we have now is going forward. I'm still, when I say 24, 48 hours are going to tell a lot, I'm not yet convinced that the Ukrainians are going to lose. They may well lose, but I think Putin has already this operation is already messed up. He may salvage it through destruction, or he may not.
Please.
Thanks. Going back to your discussion and talk about the 1930s and your optimism for, I guess, a democratic reawakening now, how does social media and the now influence of, so much information being out in the world, regardless of whether or not it's true or false, how does that affect that? Because back in the 30s, there were only a few voices that people could turn to. And if someone sees something false online now, what is your opinion about how that would affect the actual reawakening?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I always have a hard time trying to figure out what the various shifts in the media that occur, of what is their effect. Because I think I remember those of us who were sort of in what you might call the television age. Television was something that sits in a box in your room and they show stuff on it. We had what political scientists refer to as the CNN effect. So if CNN was covering some awful atrocity, it would get Americans all energized and they would want to do something about it, as if that had never happened before. But when I go back and study certain kinds of events in history, you'd be amazed what people could do with newspapers. And for instance, the Armenian genocide of 1895 was heavily covered in the United States. It was on the front page of the newspapers. And of course, in those days, there would be, major cities would have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 newspapers, all of whom would have been covering this. So it's a mistake to believe that no one was able to pay attention to anything. It's like, to me, it's like, how did you have the French Revolution without social media, So you can overstate, is what I'm saying. And then the only other thing I'd say is, it's true, everything you say is obviously true, and it's a source of great concern. It's going to get worse when people can create videos that are fake, etc. But right now, the availability of information has been a disaster for Putin and a great boon for Ukrainians, even if it doesn't ultimately save them. But certainly, Americans have been deluged with images out of Ukraine, which I think has had the effect of tremendously increasing American interest in Ukraine and what we should do about it. So, I usually argue against Tom Friedman, the internet is a force for liberation, because it's clearly, whatever else is true, it's not that. But when he says that you can't have a war anymore that doesn't get this kind of attention, if it's the right people being invaded, I guess I would have to say, then that's social media the way we hoped it would be, in a way. It's an exposure of what's happening.
I just want to thank you real quick for coming out. I've really appreciated, it's been very unflinching a look at the nature of this moment and its importance. And so I was listening to a lecture given by John Mearsheimer about the 2014 Ukraine crisis, and it's, in that he had mentioned that the United States' status as the sole superpower, our lack of an equally capable other world power, has allowed for a lackadaisical nature in American foreign policy. And as we act outwards, so too it's a symptom of our inward state. And do you believe that the United States' status as the liberal hegemon of the world has created some sort of a lackadaisical nature about American democratic vitality? If so, how would that relate to the ongoing constitutional crisis? Sorry, that was a lot. Sorry about that.
That's a good one, but I may not have the IQ for it.
I can come back later.
No. I'm trying to think through. So, just restate it for me one more time.
Yeah, I guess I'll simplify it. Is that the United States hasn't had an equally capable rival on the world stage.
I see what you're saying. Okay, I got you. I mean, look, I think I would put it slightly differently than Mearsheimer, which is that the world we've been living in for the past, let's just say, 30 or 40 years has been an unusually benevolent world. Now, needless to say, we have spent all this time saying this is the worst 30 years in the history of American foreign policy and blah, 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 blah. Well, we're about to find out that that's not true. I mean, there are worse. It can be worse, okay? But we certainly had gotten to the point where we just didn't think that people did things like this anymore. And if you don't think people do things like this anymore, and by the way, this isn't just stupid Americans not paying attention. This is the John Mearsheimers of this world telling us that this is, not John Mearsheimer himself, but there's a whole class of people who said it's not about geopolitics anymore, it's about geoeconomics, right? Countries don't need territory in a modern economic world. So why would anybody try to conquer territory? That wasn't supposed to happen. We have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, as John Mearsheimer argued, is supposed to make wars impossible, especially between two nuclear powers, right? We had a lot of stories that we told ourselves, which, by the way, are the typical Enlightenment stories, because these were exactly the same arguments that were made before World War I, when people were arguing that it was that economics had made war obsolete. This is the Enlightenment philosophy, which believes in a kind of teleology, a kind of progress, human development. With scientific improvement comes moral improvement, etc. All those things that we have believed have all been exploded now, I think. And we are now back to the kind of ugly world that we were afraid of when Dean Acheson and company did establish the post-war order. We've had this kind of awakening to the reality of power again. After convincing ourselves that was over. I mean, a friend of mine, Moises Naim, wrote a book saying power doesn't exist anymore. There is no such thing as power anymore. I mean, people talk about how the state, the nation state was going to cease to exist, right? It would all be transnational organizations. We've had every theory in the world that has now been proven, it seems to me, wrong. So how do we respond to that? It seems to me is the interesting question. And I'd be interested to see what I assume John Mearsheimer, who's has got a lot of integrity and really does stick by his position, will probably continue to say that Ukraine is not our problem, because that is a consistent position and a defensible position, by the way. But I've noticed that a lot of other people who are usually in his camp have now fallen over because of their sense of outrage at what's happening.
Thank you very much.
One more question from online, and then we'll get to yours, I promise. So the McCourtney Institute's audience tends to be interested in political reform, and I think that the question about the duopoly earlier prompted one about, what if we no longer strictly had a two-party system? America before, certainly back to the 19th and early 20th centuries has had multiple parties. Is there perhaps a failure of imagination going on here about whether we could have something like that again?
I mean, I'm sure that there is an element of that. I mean, it's a little bit of an overstatement to say that we really had multiple parties. I mean, there was the Progressive Party candidacy of Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. That was the most successful third-party candidacy in history, and it was a disaster, because if you're Roosevelt, it elected Wilson, which he thought was a disaster. So it's just, we all know the reasons why we have a two-party system, and what would we need to change? We'd have to change the way we do elections, obviously. But even then, I'm not sure. There's so much. Parties are so deeply embedded in every aspect of what we do every day that it's just very hard. Parties are not just political organizations. They are cultural organizations. They are economic organizations. They touch every aspect of our society. And as I used to joke, and this is not new either, right? I think, I don't know whether I said it in this article, in some other article, but people forget that in the 1880s and 90s, it would say in your obituary what party you were. It would say on your tombstone what party you were. And this is, of course, understandable coming out of the Civil War, because that was like, which side were you on in the Civil War? But nevertheless, it's not that partisanship is new, which is what makes me feel like it's not partisanship per se. The country has always been highly partisan. It's the fact that the partisans now no longer have any civic virtue at all. And you say civic virtue, it's not a real thing. I mean, I don't know what is civic virtue. I just know that they don't have it. And they don't even have the minimal civic virtue that the founders asked for, which was Congress should look out for congressional prerogatives, executives should look out, et cetera. So.
For more on virtue, you can check out Chris Beam, our managing director, his forthcoming book, all about democratic virtues, which will be out from the Penn State Press this summer. So.
That's great. I'm glad I'm in a place where virtue means something.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was curious, you mentioned briefly how this sort of international crisis with Ukraine can impact the domestic policies and the domestic political scene here in the United States. And I was curious if you could offer a brief commentary about how it'll affect domestic politics in Europe. You know, in Europe, we've seen this isolationist sentiment with Brexit, and then alt-right movements in France with generation identity, and then certainly a more favorable approach towards alt-right policies with democratic backsliding in Poland and the rise of Viktor Orban in Hungary. And then seemingly overnight, this has been a complete reversal with the unity in the EU and Germany and Switzerland's approach just in the past 48 hours towards Russia. So do you think this is a trend that might continue, or is it just too early to tell?
Well, obviously it's too early to tell, but yes, I do think it's a trend. I do think it's a real trend, and partly because Germany, which is the really difficult issue in Europe, because Germans rightly, it never ceases to amaze me that Americans get upset with Germans for not having a bigger military. And I don't mean that as a joke, I mean that in a serious way. I understand why Germans don't want to be a military power, and I'm glad they don't want to be a military power. So for them to be talking about increasing their defense budget by $100 billion, for them to be sending weapons to Ukraine for the first time in Germany's post-war history that they've ever sent weapons to anybody, I'm told, is a real shift. It also, I'll be very interested to see what happens to the right-wing populist movements in Europe, because in Europe as well, just as in here, you had your Tucker Carlsons and your Trumps, and they have also had to make complete about faces. Like even Zemmour in France has had to turn around. He's been very pro-Putin for a long time. Being pro-Putin is not popular in Europe right now, which means that the traditional parties in Europe stand to benefit from this. It's very, the Social Democrats in Germany, the Christian Democrats, the Green Party obviously is not a traditional party, but the Green Party, ironically, in Germany is a hawkish party. And so what you've got now, you may have a balance of power that has shifted politically, has shifted in Germany. France, I don't think there's any question. We always know what France is very inclined to national unity at times like this. They're very proud, and their leader, Macron, put a lot out there in trying to deal with Putin, and so it's not as if France didn't give it a college try. And of course, Boris Johnson is now trying to save himself politically by latching on to this. I'm sure he may also believe it, but he certainly is taking advantage of it to save himself, so in a way, and that is the Tories. I mean, you could say that I don't really think that, unfortunately, it's not a fringe party in Britain. So, but I do think that that at least for some time now, the general tenor in Europe is going to be shifting away from right-wing populism. And the one good thing is, right-wing populists are offering nationalism, but now you can be a nationalist by opposing Russia. I mean, in a way, it's given the non-nationalist parties a national rallying cry.
Take one more question here from online, and then we'll wrap up with the two here in the room. So, the U.S. identity has also been framed in part by capitalism and the sort of capitalist character of our country. How do you think about that, as if at all, I suppose, as you think about this broader argument of constitutional crisis and the future of democracy?
I mean, I think that we can see in many ways the pernicious effects of I want to say unbridled capitalism. It's not entirely unbridled, but to some extent, whether it's tech giants or whether it's the traditional, fight between capital and labor that we see all the time, and the conundrum, of course, is how do you blend freedom and liberalism with enough control over the capitalists to keep them from playing a negative role. And I think we're probably going to move forward to strike that balance. And there have been numerous attempts to strike that balance. Now, by the way, I think at the end of the day, the capitalists generally kind of win, but they also can be somewhat constrained and steered. So my guess is that we are in a period, because it's interesting to watch even the Trump Republicans are in a way have picked up on an anti-capitalist theme. So I do think that this is not a time for business to be, to feel like it can get whatever, and I don't think they feel that way. So I don't think that's really probably getting at the heart of what this question is about, and I'm sure I know what the real heart of that question is about. I'm not going to say that capitalism is antithetical to democracy. I'm not going to say that capitalism is the problem in America, because if you believe that, then you really just need a completely different America.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that different America would be, but it doesn't sound like any America that I think is plausible.
Yeah, I think perhaps the kind of heart of the question is should this notion of capitalism and its role be more a part of the dialogue about democracy than it is?
Well, I think it is, but I think it is part of the dialogue now, in various different ways, and along various different vectors. I mean, there is now such a thing called woke capitalism, which we're supposed to be upset about. And so, as I say, I don't think there's any question that, and obviously the tech giants they're in the crosshairs in various ways. So I think we're going to be talking about it.
Actually, my question kind of follows a little bit off of that one. Throughout your talk, you discussed a lot how a lot of the problems coming up in our democracy today are rooted sort of in tribalism and the sort of extremism that has come about in the more recent years. The thing I wanted to ask about, though, is you associate that to basically party loyalty, and this idea that in the 21st century, party loyalty has begun to dominate over the traditional separation of powers. And my question basically is, there's another thing that changed during that time, and that was the rise of, super PACs and the proliferation of lobbying in our government. And in discussing with other people, I found that some people do attribute this constitutional crisis and many of these things to actually the lobbying and the enabling of a lot of money to go to candidates that allows them to become extremist and to become unable to basically be removed by the diplomatic process because they have so much money to put into their campaigning that it allows them to still get elected even if they're unpopular with the regular people. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think lobbying might be part of this problem?
I mean, I'm sure to some extent it is, but I must say, when you go back to the 2016 Republican primary, who had all the money?
I do not know that off the top of my head.
Jeb Bush had all the money. He had all the Republican money. He had $100 million. He had the biggest war chest you could have because he was supposed to be the anointed. They were all behind him. Do you remember what percentage of the vote he got in Republican primaries? Now, I'm not trying to discount the role of money in politics. I definitely do think that money in politics is critical. On the other hand, I think that's been true for a really long time. And it's also true that money doesn't necessarily win you elections, And clearly, Trump did not outspend at least 3 of his Republican competitors, who had no chance. So I just don't want to go too far with it. And again, I'm not saying that it's not right, but I do think there is one problem that we all have, and I put myself in this category too. whenever there's some big crisis and it's a disaster, you want the things that you've always been concerned about to be the reasons why that happened. You know what I mean? So if you went into this thing upset about lobbying, then it was probably lobbying that had a lot to do with it. I don't mean to be dismissive of the argument, because I do take it seriously. But I do find that there is this, everybody's got the reason why this happened, which happens to be the thing they've been pounding on for years. And I just think that we need to, all of us, show more imagination, get out of our own intellectual ruts, and try to take a fresh look at what is happening. And again, I'm not saying that all of these things aren't contributing factors, including, you know, wage stagnation and other issues that have clearly played a role. But again, and I know that political scientists and other social scientists are working on this to try to figure out exactly what the variable is. But you know, when I see people talking about how you look at all the people in Pennsylvania who are feeling downtrodden because of the economic, well, they've been downtrodden for 30 or 40 years. I mean, the steel industry has been collapsing for a long time, right? So it's not as if that's what's new. So then you have to say, well, what's new? Now you could say, well, it was going to build up eventually, and that's an argument. And people have talked about what started in the Reagan years, et cetera. And maybe you could make a case that it just took time, you know? But I think you also just need to be very discerning when you're trying to discover causality. And this is something that I have to admit, I'm trying to figure out myself. How much of it were these conditions? And you could list 6 conditions, including lobbying and campaign money. And how much of it was Trump? You know, these are the kinds of things that we're going to have to try to figure out as all this evolves. All of which is a very interesting discussion, but it unfortunately does not solve any of our problems now, because whatever else is true, even if these systemic problems exist and are the cause, we're not going to solve these systemic problems by 2024. So we have near-term problems that we need to address, and then we can have a longer argument about what it all means.
Gotcha. Thank you.
My question kind of follows from Ian's a little bit. There's a history in this country of political allegiances changing, of parties, you know, coming and going. This period that we've had of the last 60 years, I think, is kind of unique in American history, where it's just two sides and very firmly rooted. My question is, when Nancy Pelosi and Biden and a lot of others say we need a strong Republican Party, we need a strong Republican Party, why? Why couldn't they? Why can't? What's the purpose of keeping this gridlock? As that gentleman said earlier, a lot of our problems come from two-party partisan gridlock. Why do we need a strong Republican Party? Why couldn't there be something else that comes into that space? And what's wrong with having a field where there are multiple parties?
Well, I don't know about the second part of your question, but the first part of it is I want the Republican Party gone. I mean, the Republican Party has demonstrated that it does not deserve to have anybody's allegiance right now. So I would like to see the Republican Party replaced in some manner, and it may require, unfortunately, we're nowhere near the requirements for that happening. In order for that to happen, the party has to be demonstrably and consistently unsuccessful. You can't tell a party that has a reasonable chance of sweeping Congress this year and taking the White House in 2024 that they really should step aside. So until we actually start beating the Republican Party, all this discussion about what the Republican Party is or isn't is beside the point. Right? Because the problem is not the Republican Party, the problem is your neighbors. Or, I mean, I'm saying figuratively, all of our neighbors who are voting Republican despite everything. Despite the fact that it has become a vehicle for Donald Trump, it is not even a party now. So, you know, I'm for getting rid of this party. But it ain't going to happen until we start voting them out.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Well, we will wrap up here. Bob, I know we were talking earlier about social media and your lack of being part of it, but where can folks find you or keep up with your work as things continue to unfold both here and abroad?
Well, I mean, read the Washington Post if you get it out here. I don't know. Do the digital waves reach all the way out here? Read my books, buy my books. My kids will thank you. I'll thank you.
Wonderful. Well,
thank
thank you for your time today and for joining us.
Thank you.